Welcome, everyone. I'm Janice Winter, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford. And the Blavatnik School of Government is hosting a series of reflections on public policy responses to COVID-19 around the world. And as part of this, I'm joined today by Dr. Gilad Isaacs. Gilad is co-director of the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, an economist at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where he coordinates the minimum wage research initiative and lectures there as well. So thanks so much for making the time to speak to us today, Gilad.
Excellent. Thanks for inviting me.
It's great to have you. Okay, so your institute has been very involved in engaging with South Africa's economic response to COVID-19. So just to begin with, could you give your assessment on this evolving response in terms of size, timing, scope, that sort of thing, and targeting?
So its context is quite important, which is that South Africa entered into a lockdown very early on, and it was one of the world's strictest lockdown, where we weren't able to leave homes at all. Basically, all but essential businesses closed. And so we saw a severe curtailment, obviously, of social and economic life, and a public health-like response, which was, unlike some countries, decisive and proactive. At the same time, that obviously placed a significant hardship on individuals and on businesses. And the economic response was extremely weak. It took over 3 weeks into the actual lockdown period, or almost so, to see any significant package like what we had seen globally. South Africa was sitting on a fiscal intervention of about 0.1% of our GDP, when the G20 average was at about 10% of GDP. So really an insignificant response, which led to a sort of widespread frustration and proposals put forward. We eventually saw a rescue package plan. It was put forward at the outset at 500 billion rand, which is about 10% of our GDP. But once you start to unpack the various layers and those details, what you actually see is that it's deeply insufficient in protecting workers and businesses.
Okay, so just following up on that, if you could go into some of those details. We've seen that when that was announced, that 500 billion, the president acknowledged that the rescue package and the size of the rescue package should be commensurate with the scale of the crisis, as has been noted everywhere. But as we sing in many countries, the cliche is often true that the devil is in the details. So if you could just go into some of what you're saying about the fact that it is actually not quite as generous as was hoped.
Excellent. So I think there's various ways in which to assess this, both in general and in detail. The first, I would say, is whether or not it has a macroeconomic impact which we want. Is it injecting new funds into the economy in a way which will support the economy? Obviously, recognizing that we are actively slowing the economy at the same time. And what we actually see is that most of that, the overwhelming amount, is not new funds. There is 2/5 of it is in loan guarantees. Over 1/5 is in existing budgetary funds being moved around. And so you really see a minority of that being an injection of spending into the economy. The next way we can assess that is whether or not it's actually sufficient in its individual aspects. Okay, so for instance, like elsewhere, there is a wage support scheme to help businesses pay wages, right? That is, it is 40 billion rand, which is 2 billion pounds roughly. And that only provides income support at the lowest level under our national minimum wage. It doesn't reach at the highest level. It is about 2/3 of income, and it is only enough to cover about a third of the formal sector workforce, right? And you can unpack the various elements like that, right? There is a loan guarantee scheme, but there is no bailout fund for businesses which are over indebted. Already there was an increase to our social grants, our social transfers, but one which, for instance, South Africa's, there is a grant for each caregiver of a child that was increased, but increased at a low level, and actually increased not for every child, but for each caregiver. So if you have 4 children, you only see one increase. So you can unpack the various details, and you see that there's insufficiencies. Lastly, I would say that when we think about these things, we need to have a criteria against which we measure these things. And we've put forward, which builds off other analysis, a set of like various rules, right? Which we've referred to as go early, right? That it's important to act early. Go big, that you need to implement significant rescue. Go household. Go simple, because there is state capacity issues. Go survival, to ensure households and businesses survive, and then target this in various ways. And unfortunately, what we've seen is a violation of most of those principles, and therefore a real failure to offer the kinds of support which is needed.
And so what is, given this kind of package that we're seeing at the moment, what is the projected impact that this is going to have, the entire crisis is going to have in the South African economy and on the lives and livelihoods of households and communities? And if you could just put it into perspective, speaking to the economic situation of South Africa before this crisis even hit. So, the areas of vulnerability and the people that are going to be hardest hit by this.
Absolutely. In the South African context, I mean, you're looking at a expanded definition of unemployment of over 30% prior to this. You're looking at a poverty headcount of almost 2/3, and you're looking at extreme levels of inequality. Our median income, for instance, in South Africa, to put it in pound terms, is perhaps around 200 pounds. Okay, so per month. So half of the population earns under that. So, a significantly fragile socio-economic circumstance. At the same time, there's been a relatively weak economic growth anyway, which obviously means also a stress on public finances. Unlike in the developed world where interest rates are extremely low, our state hasn't got access to the same kind of cheap financing, although we argue that there are mechanisms available. So you've got a far more vulnerable population and a fragile economy and weak public finances moving in. In terms of the impact which we're expecting, I mean, the various modeling estimates vary. The official estimates from our Reserve Bank, even with the interventions which we've seen, is a GDP fall to -6%. The other estimates from academics and the private sector go up to 10 to 15%, with some estimates of job losses in anywhere from like 1 million to 3 million. Just to give context, the formal sector workforce in South Africa is around 11 million. So a substantial increase in unemployment. Of course, everyone's doing the best estimates which they can, but those aren't certain. But even with these rescue measures, we're expecting widespread bankruptcy. There's already been a rise in hunger, and we'll see increased poverty and unemployment.
And before we go into ways that this could be mitigated in some sense if the rescue package were to be made more generous, just speaking lastly about the response, the last question on that front, there seems to be agreement that there is a significant degree of incoherence in the economic policy response of South Africa. So I'd love you to be able to just explain why that is so, and also the degree to which you think this is a feature of South African economic policy more generally, or just the result of the difficulties of policymaking in a context in which rapid and decisive action is necessary, trade-offs are enormous, and information kind of evolving over time.
I think both of those play a role here. I think that everyone suffers from like the latter. So what's more interesting in the South African instance is that first element. And essentially what we see in the South African states is that parts of the ruling party and the state take a more interventionist economic stance, and parts of it have a much more laissez-faire, austerity orientated, free market privatization, liberalization approach. And the National Treasury and the Reserve Bank have been the sort of bulwarks of those conservative policy narratives. And so what we see is a health response driven by those who are wanting to intervene, certain forms of economic response to certain industries driven by those within government who are in control of those areas which have this much more interventionist approach, and then a resistance from the National Treasury in particular, which still is locked into a austerity mindset, from making available the sorts of the funds which is needed. And this speaks to a broader contestation and incoherence within both the ANC as a political entity and the South African state. That's then compounded by weak implementation. Even in that wage support program, which we've seen, we've seen about 5% of businesses who need that wage support able to access it within the first month. So there's a severe either unwillingness or inability to actually implement.
So given that implementation issue and possibly state capacity limitations, what do you think an appropriate rescue package would look like for South Africa, both to cushion the immediate impact that we're seeing from COVID-19, but also to establish the foundations for a more sustainable economy and to address some of the underlying issues that are at play?
Janice, what I think's frustrating for those of us who have pushed for this is, in one sense, it's not rocket science. There's globally so many examples of what's working and what isn't, right? And South Africa obviously needs to pursue a number of those elements, right? Which is increased wage support, increased income transfers to households, a larger fund for business bailouts, in particular for small and medium enterprises, and a more substantive cushioning for businesses of demand, for instance, through increased public procurement of domestic goods or other ways of maintaining local businesses. So that's some of the kind of general things. We think that needs to be twice the size of what it is now, which would amount to around a trillion rand, which you can divide by 20 and get pounds, which for some reason I'm not doing well in my head right now. But then you also have very South African specific instances which overlap with other countries. So our public transport system, many poor people live very far, take overcrowded public like taxis, and are exposed to significant risks in that period, as in London, let's say, right? But how can you open a economy, in such circumstances? Not all employers can afford PPE requirements, and yet it is workers who are on the front lines. What sort of hazard pay is needed? So there's a range of those elements which is specific to our context. Lastly, and I think it's really important that you phrase what you have posed like this, is it's not only about thinking about just the immediate response. It is about thinking about how do we use the recovery phase to ensure that we are not simply reinforcing the existing unequal economy with which we went in, right? And I think that's really important. And we've been doing work on what is globally called a just recovery, which attempts to integrate the recovery from COVID into other transformational policies, in particular in climate change policy, because this is a precursor to the sorts of economic and social crises which we might see moving forward. So that means looking at increased social transfers in the long run, altering the nature of work, of employment contracts, of wages, of precarity, ensuring that our public services are recentered, whether that's health or in transport. So we're transforming those services in a way in which more people have better access. That in industries, we're not simply reinvesting in airlines, but are going to invest in uh, in like rail with like renewable energy, and so those sorts of transformative uh, notions of how we want to restructure and recalibrate our economies are important to build into our plans now.
Yeah, that's a really, really important addition. Now, in terms of the pushback to some of these policies and advocacy around these issues, some in government, especially in Treasury, sort of question the viability of the levels of spending associated with these initiatives, and often highlight South Africa's deficit and significant levels of public indebtedness. How robust do you think that is as a defense? And how would such interventions be funded? Where would the money be found?
Yeah, I think it's true and misleading, right? In our debt levels in entering this, South Africa was around the emerging market average of 60% of debt to GDP, which as you'll know, is way under the UK and other advanced economies. At the same time, the cost of our borrowing is significantly higher, and it is eating into a increasing share of our expenditure, and that obviously therefore means less spending on health and education and so on. So it would be very important to think not simply of the amount of borrowing, but its costs also. And that's where the various policy spheres intersect with one another. The importance of our Reserve Bank buying government debt, because that's an effective means of reducing interest rates. The idea of compelling large institutional investors like pension funds to buy a special COVID bond that is at a reduced rate. The leveraging of quasi-public funds like our government employee pension fund. So there's all sorts of other ways to try and reduce financing. At the same time, there are areas that are under taxed, as we've seen worldwide, in particular in wealth tax and in illicit financial flows. So there is an ability there to ensure increased revenue. But the second way of posing that same question is to say, well, can we afford not to, right? And of course, public finances is a concern, but by all accounts, our public finances will be worse if we have hundreds of thousands of businesses going bankrupt, right? It's fairly obvious that you have to, in a crisis like this, maintain the viability of your economy, right, in order to ensure that you aren't going to see a massive fall in tax-like revenue over and above the impact that has on individual lives, and so on. And yet we're stuck in a pathological adherence to a austerity mindset within parts of the state, which is somehow closing its eyes to these realities. Interestingly, our business sector, who has previously had a strong austerity orientation, obviously realized that they need bailouts, and public funds are essential. So the resistance has really come from this relatively small group centered in Treasury. So I believe that we can afford it, but I also believe that we can't afford not to.
In terms of that just recovery, a lot of economists and activists globally are expressing hope that this crisis actually offers an opportunity to disrupt exactly those economic orthodoxies, especially given that most countries have responded by embracing expansionary fiscal policies, and because some of these deficiencies of the existing economic system globally are becoming much more starkly evident. At the same time, though, it seems that it would be naive not to recognize that the crisis is exacerbating and compounding existing inequalities rather than necessarily disrupting them. And also that increases in this emergency spending also present an opportunity for established centers of economic power to justify doubling down on these orthodoxies in a sort of recovery phase. So how do you anticipate this contestation playing out, and specifically to South Africa as well, but generally also?
No, I think that's exactly right, and a good question. And I think you could even add to what you said now. Not only could there be a doubling down on those orthodoxies, but actually you see that there's forces who are attempting to use this as an opportunity, right? We could see the neoliberal architects, or whichever word you would use, have been very active in trying to see how this offers an opportunity of continuing to orientate the economy towards a minority share of interest, right? And so we shouldn't be naive only in seeing it as an opportunity, right? At the same time, you're absolutely right that we have to use this in that way. I think that one of the crucial things is a shift in our power relationships, and this is where the current recovery package and the long term intersect in a way that's sort of really in a like underlying way. The only way to reshape the economy in the medium term is if working people, their allies in other income groups, if the majority can gain enough influence in society to enact the kinds of reforms which we need, right? And I think that's really where this linkage comes in, and that's what we have to watch out for now. So, for instance, in businesses which receive public funds, right? Why should workers not be given a voice on boards or in management, as a reciprocation for the bailouts or government funds, right? And that would not only be a way of changing that business, but it would be a broad shift in the relationships in society about who actually holds power where. And so hardwired into the type of interventions now, whether that's through a basic income grant, whether that is through worker representation in businesses, whether that's through sovereign wealth funds, which have popular control over bailed out businesses, and a range of other means. We need to ensure that the interventions are moving power away from the few and in labor's terms into the hands of the many.
Yeah, critical. And especially as globally there's emphasis on all these essential workers who are holding things together across the world, being those that are often overlooked completely or given very few rights in these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just following up on that, again, within the South African context, President Ramaphosa has spoken about the need to kind of forge this new social compact, very optimistic pronouncement, and the fact that there's radical economic transformation, he even used, that prioritizes fairness and empowerment, justice, equality. How much confidence do you place in some of these pronouncements that he's making? And specifically, do you anticipate seeing any of this reflected in the revised 2020 budget that the Minister of Finance is going to be presenting within the next couple of weeks?
I think the president's instincts are real. I don't think he's standing up there knowing, like some prime ministers, that he is lying to everybody. That's not a jab at your prime minister in particular. Of course not. So I think he's being genuine in wanting to see this as a transformative moment. I think it does come down to, who holds sway within government, within society more broadly, and who's able to exercise influence over that moving forward. So the jury's out, and the jury's out not only because of him, but the jury's out because of who's going to be able to really kind of like put ideas forward and build like momentum behind those. But do I expect those to be immediately visible? Absolutely not. The review, just for some context, the South Africa's budget this year was one of its most austere, which really advanced significant budget cuts. I don't expect to see a reversal of that approach or that mindset. I simply expect to see a accommodation for the type of rescue which I've mentioned so far within that. And it's really going to be a fight within South Africa over the next 6 months, 3 years, 5 years to see which vision wins out.
Be interesting to see if any parts of business remain on board with some of that recognition after having been the beneficiaries of some of these policy interventions.
Yeah.
Okay, so last one to end on. If you could persuade the government to adopt just one of the bold initiatives that the IEJ has proposed in responding to COVID-19, wholeheartedly adopted comprehensively as you ask for it, which intervention would that be and why?
Geez, I've got two. Okay, but
I'll allow you.
It's in it's income support, right? And that in these moments you're asking people to stay home, and you have to then pay them to stay home, or they're going to go out and look for work and infect one another and lead to a public health crash. And that's income support, both in terms of wage guarantees, which I think are really important, and the advancement of some comprehensive social security, whether that's through in a basic income, through like a once-off, or permanent, if that is in the existing social grants, some level of universal income transfers to poor and low income households in particular. So that would be where I would go, and that would obviously have a knock-on impact into spending, local economies, sustaining people in the short term, but also keeping businesses alive. And lastly, I think that plays into what I was talking about earlier, which is a power shift. Once there is a basic income, it's much harder to exploit workers to the same extent that you were previously, right? And so I think that can play a ameliorating impact right now, and I think it's a progressive policy moving forward.
Brilliant. Gilad, you're doing such important work. Wishing you all the best. I know it must be exhausting times for you at the moment, but thank you very, very much for giving us your time today.
Excellent. Thanks, Janice. Good luck with everything there.
Great.